Hello, 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 everybody. How are we doing? Good afternoon. It is Friday Food for Thought session, and we are back in the, not in the kitchen. Oopsie. There we go. Lost me for a second. I'm back. We are back here and talking about all things soy today. So a topic that often comes up for vegetable-based diets and some of our menus, and using various food sources of soy. And I'm going to talk a little bit to it over the next half an hour, because there's all sorts of myths and misunderstandings and all sorts of noise in the sort of soy space, and it can be quite a valuable food, but there's just some things to maybe consider. And we often hear about different issues with it that relate to health concerns, and particularly around the phytoestrogen content, which I'll get into. So I'll talk to it all and all the different forms of it and what it all kind of looks like. So that's what the next little bit is going to be about. So check in, swipe in, let me know who's here. And as we go, if you have any questions about soy in particular, or plant-based diets, because that's what this is leaning to a little bit, using a plant-based protein, just let me know. Pat Govender is here. How are you doing, Pat? Caitlin says soy-ish. I can't. So maybe you haven't tried it. I'll finish off with a couple ideas of how and where we can use it. I'm sure there actually are things that are soy containing that you've had, Caitlin, maybe just not in its raw form. Karen, good afternoon. How are you doing? Let me know as we go, guys. So we're going to jump straight into it. And obviously everything here today is all things soy. So we're going to firstly might as well touch on what soy actually is. So it's a bean. So that little image there, you can see that's what a soybean looks like after it's been harvested. And the history of it goes back to way back when, 10,000 years ago. So between about 7 and 11,000 years ago was the first kind of belief of soy being used for a food source. And that was mainly kind of the East, and in the Western cultures, it's been a little bit more recent, of 300 years, but still a fairly long time for a crop of some kind. And it's massive. I'll get to a slide in a bit to kind of show you where it all ends up. But over 350 million tons of it is produced every year to go into various applications. As a food source, it's quite different to other beans and legumes because it gives us a little bit of everything. There's some protein, there's some fat, there's some carbohydrate, and there's some fiber. So it's kind of a complete package of all those things, which is unique, particularly because the protein content is quite high compared to others. It also provides a source of fat, which most other plant protein sources or beans and legumes don't. And it's also a complete source of protein, which means its amino acid profile is really good. Most of the other beans and legumes will lack something to make it an incomplete protein. So soy can be quite valuable from that source. Plus there's also some carbohydrate for energy and loads of fiber. So in its bean form, we get a little bit of everything. It then also provides us two other things that I'll mention, which are isoflavones, which is an antioxidant, essentially a plant nutrient, and phytosterols, which is also a sterol that comes from plant. So a form of an alcohol that comes from a plant, not the alcohol you and I kind of know, but chemically, two things that are plant-based. And that's where most of the kind of health questions come around, or the health benefits from those two compounds, which I'm going to chat to in a little bit. Then there are also some anti-nutrients that are present in soybeans. And just to mention a few things like goitrogens, tannins, phytates, and something called trypsin inhibitors. And I'll touch on what anti-nutrients are. But essentially in a soybean, there's a whole lot going on. All right. If you have a look at this, it was quite a nice clean slide. It might be a little bit small on your side, but I'll talk through it. I got this off the guys at examine.com. Great little website if you're looking for information on products and supplements and some health questions. It's worth kind of spending a bit of time reading there. But they had this great graphic of essentially what happens to a soybean after it's been picked and where it ends up. So right up at the top, you see soybeans in its kind of natural form. It kind of goes one of two ways off there, either crushed into flakes or kind of flour that'll end up either going to an animal feed or it gets processed further down into like the meat products alternatives, TVP, which is textured vegetable protein. So like soy mince, all of those things come off like a crushed flake, or they process it a little bit further into a soy protein, a supplement protein, or they just keep the flour. So that's sort of the dried form of it. They can also, like I said, there's a source of oil or fat in a soybean. So they can extract the oil, which has a lot of industrial uses, used in a variety of things from cosmetics to medicines to all sorts of things. And then in the food manufacture space as well, a source of fat in a lot of products. And in a cooking oil, soybean oil is a cooking oil that's quite commonly used, a fairly cheap source. So that's kind of going down the dried route. And then the food side of it, that's a little less processed. From a soybean, it might go straight to something like soy milk, which we all know about. And from soy milk, they make tofu. And beans can also be fermented into a couple different products like tempeh and soy sauce that we know about, or miso, and I'll touch on those in a little bit. So one thing goes a hell of a long way, which shows its value in terms of the agricultural chain and why they're making over 350 or growing 350 million tons of it every year. Now, to touch on the things that are inside a soybean, and the first is the anti-nutrients, which is one of the things that often gives it a bad rep. But anti-nutrients, as the term kind of suggests, is something that impacts nutrients. So those listed components are things that can impair the way your body is able to digest or absorb another nutrient. So it contains these things, and things like tannins, the same that we get in tea, and that can impact our body's absorption of something like iron. So it's an anti-nutrient. It gets in the way of our body using something else. What's good about the processing methods of soy and other things as well that contain anti-nutrients is that most processing methods will get rid of them. So if we boil something or we roast them, and these anti-nutrients do drop quite significantly, which means the argument around the impact of anti-nutrients that are present in soybeans gets nullified the more processed or cooked it becomes, because it can destroy those and they'll no longer be active, which is good. Then the isoflavones, you'll remember that, and the phytosterols were the two kind of focus points in terms of ingredient or components in a soybean. And it's this one that normally brings around the discussion in terms of estrogen, because isoflavones are a phytoestrogen. So it's similar to estrogen, but phyto means it comes from a plant. Where estrogen is obviously a hormone that humans produce. This acts like estrogen does. It's an antioxidant in properties, but its structure is very similar to estrogen. So it can bind to the same receptors in your body and cause a similar downstream action that estrogen does. And that's where all the kind of the discussion around it has often come from. But that's also where the benefit of it comes from. So it often gets spoken about in a negative light, but the health benefits of soy are related to this as well. One thing about them is that the isoflavone content of all the different places that you get soy is quite varied, and that'll depend on when and where it's grown, so the farming methodology, what the soil's been like, then the processing after that. So come from a soybean right down to soy sauce, and everything in between. That's all going to impact how much is actually left in there, and then the storage and the cooking and everything's going to impact it. So it's quite hard to actually get an accurate call on the isoflavone content of various things. Even within the same food, most of the research shows how variable it is. So a stick of tofu can have a very high or very low level of isoflavone. So it's quite difficult to monitor it and get an accurate read on it. Some things are a little bit better than others, but this is the active ingredient when we're talking about health impacts. Now, the foods that you and I are kind of exposed to quite predominantly, firstly, edamame beans. You'll see a couple of recipes. I've used those. We've got a lovely little edamame dip. I did that about a year ago now, I remember. A lovely source of it, edamame beans. If you ever go out to a Thai restaurant or go grab some sushi, and you get the little shells and they just steamed or roasted and salted, and you can snack on those. They're great. It's essentially the fresh form of it before it's cooked, and they're a really good source of protein, carbs, fiber, and fat, a little bit of everything. Then soy milk, which is quite common to us. What that is, the edamame bean or the soybeans are soaked and cooked and ground, and it forms this little like slurry slush, pretty similar to when you're making almond milk or oat milk or any of those milk alternatives, and it's strained through. The nice thing about soy milk compared to other milk alternatives is that you also get some protein from here. So almond milk, oat milk, rice milk, all of those are, apart from almond milk, which is you can get fairly low calories, pretty much flavored water. But the other milk alternatives will mainly be a bit of carbohydrate, maybe a little bit of fat. Whereas soy milk, you're going to get a source of protein. So it's the only milk alternative that you can get that. And then similarly, a soy yogurt, which will just be a cultured version of your soy milk. Then tofu is really just the cheese version of soy milk. So similar processing, going from cow's milk to making cheese. You'd go from soy milk to making tofu. And then you're left with the tofu blocks, which are essentially the curds of soy milk. And again, a really good source of protein, carbohydrate, and a little bit of fat, but a nice plant-based vegetarian option for a protein, because it's one of the highest concentrations of protein compared to other plant sources. It is quite mild in flavor, and often with our recipes, you'll find different ways of doing them. It's always about trying to get as much flavor into them. It's also a textural thing. There are different types of tofu, but you can use them quite effectively. As long as you get some flavor in them, you can get some texture on them, and it gives you a nice option to make a little bit of use of. You can also, we've got a few things like scrambled tofu, where instead of scrambled eggs, got a nice option for breakfast. You can use it as cubes in different ways. So it's quite a versatile plant protein, which is really cool. Then tempeh and miso are fermented beans. So tempeh would resemble a tofu block essentially, but you'd still be able to see the beans. And then you get the fermented benefits of it. So that does improve some of the nutritional profiles, particularly with those anti-nutrients we spoke about. Fermentation is going to break down some of that. Adds quite a deep level of flavor to it as well. And a good source of probiotics, essentially a good fermented food. So tempeh and miso, both of those are good options to try and get in a little bit of naturally fermented foods. And again, they're going to give you some protein and carbohydrates because they're still in the bean form originally. They're going to give you some fiber and a little bit of the naturally occurring fat. So quite a nice thing to actually include some of. Then soy sauce would be a byproduct of those fermented products. So the fluid that's sort of left around afterwards is extracted, cleaned up into soy sauce, and we all know that and the lovely flavor that adds. Essentially flavor, a little bit of sodium, but we don't get any of the protein, carbohydrate, fat from soy sauce, but it's a nice way to season a lot of things. Then the most processed of the foods that we are kind of used to is soy protein. That would be in a minced form, a meat alternative. The term I used a little earlier was that textured vegetable protein, TVP. You can make all sorts of different shapes and things with. So it is the most processed, typically quite low in fat, typically low in carbohydrates, and predominantly a little bit of protein. All right. And that can also be in the form of a soy protein concentrate or a soy protein isolate, which would be the supplement that you might use to as an alternative to whey or something like that. So your soy protein in the supplement form, also pretty good quality. So those are the foods of them. The big discussion around this really relates to health. And there are a couple areas that are sort of the main topics. And the first one is around thyroid health. And a lot of this discussion comes about due to the phytoestrogen and goitrogen component. But from most evidence and trials, is the evidence just isn't really there to support that. That said, there actually just isn't any good research into it. So a lot of it's either observational or anecdotal, but we haven't really had any good trials where they might supplement with phytoestrogens or isoflavones and see what actually happens to thyroid health. So there's not, you can't really draw firm conclusions from it, but some of the anecdotal evidence does lead to suggestions that a very high intake, so possibly more than you'd normally get in if you had it once or twice a week. You'd need to be having a good few doses of it every day, and quite a large amount, that it might impact hypothyroidism, so an underactive thyroid. Right, but that's very, very high intakes. Cardiovascular health. Again, there's no real decent long-term studies on this. Most of them are observational, which means they've just had a look at people who may or may not be eating soy and what the health outcome is, as opposed to a trial where they would feed someone and see what the outcome at the end of it is. But the observational studies do support a bit of a protective mechanism to it, where there's a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, heart disease, and stroke. Some of it's due to people who already have high blood pressure. It might help lower the blood pressure a little bit. It can improve the integrity of blood vessel walls and help with the health of that. And it can reduce the bad cholesterol, the LDL components of cholesterol. But there isn't really sufficient evidence to support this from a health claim point of view. So the evidence isn't robust enough. So even the American Heart Association, they used to recommend supplementation with things like isoflavones or soy protein to benefit cardiovascular disease, and they're backtracking on those kinds of claims now because the evidence just isn't strong enough. But there isn't anything there that says it would negatively affect cardiovascular health. Then the two, I sort of chest to say here, man boobs, #myth. So exactly. The two areas of both men's and women's health are a little bit more commonly spoken about in the soy intake sort of realm. And the reason for that, particularly on a men's health point of view, is that it can theoretically inhibit the body's production of testosterone, so produce less testosterone because of the intake of phytoestrogens. At a moderate level, so again, if you're having it a couple times a week, it doesn't seem to be the case at all. But again, very high intakes where it's a good few portions a day and maybe in a supplemental dose of it, it might have an impact on fertility. It might decrease testosterone and increase estrogen, but that is having to get in a fair bit. Interestingly, as a protective side for men's health, is that anyone who's at risk of prostate cancer may benefit by including soy in their diet. So it can reduce the risk of prostate cancer in high-risk individuals. If someone's already got prostate cancer, it doesn't seem to have an impact one way or another, positively or negatively. But for any at-risk people, it could be a useful food to include a little bit more regularly. From a woman's health point of view, focusing on two different areas, postmenopausal and premenopausal. For postmenopausal women, there is a possible benefit because what it does as a phytoestrogen is act like estrogen. So post-menopause, when estrogen production is low, it can bind to the receptors that estrogen normally would and cause the cascade impact that the action of estrogen. But there's a flip side to the coin that also gets in the way of any other estrogen, naturally occurring estrogen, which works more effectively and has a bigger influence than a phytoestrogen does. Right. So when there's zero estrogen, it can act in that place, although a weaker form of it. But if there's just a little bit, it can get in the way. So there's kind of like a pros and cons to it. But what this looks like in terms of health impacts is that in postmenopausal women, intake of soy can reduce the risk of developing breast cancer and also reduce the risk of mortality, so death from breast cancer. There is also the reduced frequency and severity of hot flashes. Obviously, we know about that in terms of postmenopause symptoms. And it can also help increase bone mineral density. So one of the health concerns postmenopause is the density and the health of bone. So soy intake can improve that. Premenopausal women, it can have more of a negative effect. So because the body's already producing estrogen, that intake of phytoestrogens can get in the way, which leads to things like a reduction in follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which are involved in menstrual cycle and fertility. And the length of the menstrual cycle can also be impacted when soy intake is quite high. What this means in terms of fertility is unclear, but we know that the mechanism is there, so it might be kind of getting in the way. But there does still seem to be a reduction in mortality and risk of breast cancer. So for females that are at risk of breast cancer, it can be useful to include soy as an option because of these benefits. Not in high amounts, but a little regular intake is okay. All right. To kind of wrap it together, what this means, moderate consumption of soy is unlikely to have any negative effect. So I think a lot of the myths and mysteries around it are overdone on poor science and anecdote. There can be some benefit to it, and it seems from the evidence that there's more benefit than harm. And this relies on, or this speaks to cardiovascular health and cancer risk. So two good upsides to there. But eating a very large amount of it, so multiple portions, multiple days per week for an extended period of time, they give it a note of 6 months or more, could cause problems. So as with anything, we want it to possibly form part of a varied and balanced diet, but in small and moderate amounts, it's going to be good. The only caveat here, and I didn't go into too much detail, but soy infant formula may be something that we want to limit. And there are sort of different reasons for that, and that's maybe a chat on its own, but not a very good option in terms of the other alternatives that are out there when we're looking for a dairy-free infant formula. I think there might be a question just looking at the last one there at the bottom. So that's the summary of it and a bit of an idea around soy, possibly a little bit more benefit than risk. And some upside to having a moderate amount of it. The foods, we know there are different places we can use it. We've got various recipes where it comes into play. I think that the take home from this is don't be afraid to try it. Use it, play around with it. It can give you an alternative, a plant-based alternative to a meat protein or another protein, and it's really good quality. So I think it's something we can all at least have a little bit of. All right. So I want to get to the questions that came in. I saw there were just a couple of them. Pat, I bet if you make your soy prawns, you'll love it, Caitlin. Love it. I want to see that happen. So Caitlin, there's a challenge. You're open to trying it. Beautiful. Kath agrees with that as well. Shirley, how's it going? Lauren is here. Everyone who checked in a couple of minutes after I started. Michelle, how are you? Iva's here as well. Iva, nice to have you with us. Beverly Shengiwe says, hi, legends. Chesa, why is tempeh and miso so pricey when the rest of soy products are quite reasonable? Mainly because of the fermentation process, which takes quite a long time. So because they've got to inoculate it with whatever they want to ferment it in, the bacteria, and then it takes time. So it's aging it, which is why it gets more expensive. Tempeh is still, you're going to use it kind of similar to tofu. So like cost to serving ratio for the benefit of it can be quite high. But miso, you end up using so little of it because it's so rich in flavor. So one of my favorite things is just those little tubs of it that you get, and it'll stick in my fridge for quite a while. And it's a fantastic way to get a nice umami flavor into your meals. Lovely, delicious richness to it. That rounds off a lot of things. So the miso is a nice thing because that'll last you forever. So yes, it's $100 for the tub, but it will last a good long while. And because it's fermented, it's got quite a long sort of open shelf life as well. Tempeh a little bit more pricey, but purely because of how difficult it is really to kind of get it onto the shelf. Shirley, where was that message? I seem to have lost it. Is it true that children and babies that have a dairy intolerance would most likely have a similar reaction to soy? This is what your pediatrician said. So you can't use soy milk formula as an alternative. So no, I wouldn't really agree with that. So the dairy allergy or intolerance would be based on either milk. So if it's an allergy, it's going to be to the milk protein, which is specific to dairy. If it's an intolerance, it's likely to be to lactose, which is the sugar in dairy, none of which are present in soy. But for other reasons, which I didn't get into today, but kind of just ended with the take-home message, I'd still wouldn't use soy formula because of the phytoestrogen content and all the what ends up happening is because that's the only thing that an infant's having. Relative, in an adult, it gets diluted into the rest of our diet, but it's the only thing they're having. So that phytoestrogen content is very high, which obviously that's not something that's normally in breast milk or formula. So that's the main sort of reason for it. So I'd look for an alternative plant-based option. Chesa, you heard this, so unfortunate they might grow out of it. I don't know if you're answering Shirley's there. So if it's an allergy, not likely to grow out of it. If it's an intolerance, quite possibly. Teresa, you love miso. Your problem is limiting your intake. So it's so rich though. It's quite hard to have a lot of it. But like if you're adding a tablespoon of it, you're adding a nice little whack of a bit of some protein, some fiber, even a little bit of carbs and fat. So it's not you could definitely be adding worse things. So I wouldn't worry too much, but I can't have a lot of it just because it's a rich flavor. And I love that. Shirley, only a pleasure. Cool. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of background on some soy, and hopefully something, if it's not normal in your diet, that you do just try it. A little bit more of a sustainable source of protein. So once or twice a week, get it in there, whatever form. So whether it's edamame beans, nice, easy go-to, you can mix it up in different ways, maybe some tofu in whatever version. And you can just experiment with them and see how it goes. Or get some flavor into something. Teresa, you should go see I think I posted in the app, miso oats for a nice savory morning oats. A lovely little recipe, miso and sriracha. Love it. If it's not in there, I'll share it with you. Guys, so that's a little bit of food for thought for Friday. Hopefully you've learned something, a bit of a takeaway. Enjoy the rest of what's left of the week this afternoon and work out tomorrow. For those of you coming towards the end of week 1 and your challenges, well done. Can you believe you're almost 30% of the way there? So keep going hard, keep pushing hard, keep logging your workouts, posting your pics, chatting in your groups, whatever the case is. Is anyone here from my challenge? You guys are legends. You're rocking it. Really enjoying what I'm seeing. And next week, we pick it up all again. I look forward to seeing you guys then. So have a fabulous weekend, guys. See you all on Monday. Cheers.